What do you think drove Hamas to attack Israel at this moment, as opposed to, next year or a couple years before?
Well, that's like the $64,000 question, right? What
Yeah.
motivated the attack, and why is it at that time point? I've seen different perspectives on it. Some experts in international politics would say, well, this was a purposeful attack to derail the Abraham Accords, specifically the peace deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel. This was meant to spoil the signing and rapprochement between Riyadh and Tel Aviv. That plays in part. Some of it, I think, there's a reality that escalatory violence is the only way that Hamas and supporters of Hamas see that the occupation getting on the radar of the international community. So we need to use escalatory violence in order to draw attention to this. And this is the only way we can get the release of Palestinians that are imprisoned in Israel, some of which have been formally charged, hundreds, if not thousands of which face no formal charges, right? And so they viewed this victimization of civilians as a bargaining chip. They saw it work in the past when they've kidnapped Israeli soldiers, being able to release Palestinian prisoners. So there's part of that strategic logic, perhaps on the ground. There's the international political side. I mean, there's still questions. I haven't seen any reliable reporting or analysis on whether or not the political wing of Hamas was really cued in to the attacks. To what extent did Hamas's political leaders in Qatar know about Al-Qassam Brigade's attacks, either in the planning and the extent to which? It was clear that Hamas ended up targeting both civilians and IDF soldiers. If this was an attack that was limited to the military, they would have been legitimate targets. It would have been an escalation, but it would have looked far different than the fact that it extends to killing 1,200 or 1,100 Israeli civilians.
Yeah.
Right. And so the motivate, you can think about the politics, what's the political motivation, but you also have to think about what's the motivation of people on the ground. What are people facing, right? In order to be able to kill civilians, either Palestinian civilians or in this case Israeli civilians. You have accounts of Hamas militants phoning in, calling families, saying, "Listen, we got through the gates. I was able to kidnap or kill these Israeli Jews." And the parents of these fighters, there's some clips of they're just devastated. They're saying, "Okay, well, come home. We don't know what's going on, but just come home."
Yeah.
The Atlantic reporter Graham Wood's been really good on this. He's a good source to just track these individual narratives.
Yeah.
Of these mostly young men going out, they're hyped up on amphetamines and other drugs, right? And then ends up being just this spasmodic, just brutal acts of inhumane violence.
Yeah, no, and it seems like in terms of the attack, with just the amount of civilians and military targets, IDF soldiers that Hamas was able to kill within hours, it seems like even they were surprised by how, if you want to call it successful or how effective their attack was.
Right.
Yeah, because there are some of the most gruesome videos. Obviously, the carnage is incredibly gruesome, but like when you see a Hamas militant toss a grenade into a house and then they go in and pick up a piece of fruit and they're just kind of like casually just like, oh, I have so much time. Like no one's here trying to stop us. I'm just going to like go through the fridge because the fruit was inside. It didn't get destroyed by the grenade. And they're just like eating fruit as bodies are burning outside. It's like it's like they almost didn't know what to do with the extra time. They're like, I guess we should just, keep going if no one's gonna show up.
There's certainly an absurdity to it. There's a disorientation both from combatants and civilians, right? And I think there's this. I think you're right that the amount of carnage they were able to unleash in such a shortened time span was just unexpected. And so you have everyday rank and file soldiers, right, terrorists in this case, just kind of confuses. Well, what do we do next? Where do we go? Confusion over whether or not the initial plans were to primarily target Israeli Defense Forces. In the days after the attack, the spokesperson for Hamas says, "Well, we only targeted IDF soldiers." It's like that's patently false, right? There's an interview between a Hamas spokesperson and a reporter in Saudi Arabia, and to her credit, this woman calls this guy to account and says, "That's not true. You killed civilians." And then there's the extent to what extent did this violence escalate? Obviously, we talked about the fog of war, the fact that just in my experience, either in political protests or acts of political violence, things escalate very quickly, and you don't need that many bad actors for situations to get very, very violent or dangerous.
Mm.
I tell I tell my students when they do study abroad, one of the worst things you can do is go to a public protest, even if you think it's peaceful and exciting. You just don't know how these things escalate, and they can get violent very, very quickly. And even in a large crowd of people, you don't need that many bad actors to escalate and really increase violence.
Yeah, no, that's just as a side tangent. That's something that we've been lucky enough to not experience with the Panamanian roadblocks, but there have been plenty of fights between farmers and protesters because the farmers can't get their produce through. They're throwing out thousands of gallons of milk a day. They're tossing out vegetables. And then there was there was a Panamanian the other day who went up to a roadblock and just shot two protesters and then started directing traffic, telling people like, you're good now, we can go through the road. And that was caught on video, and that was wild to watch. So it's like me and my girlfriend were careful to be very aware of our surroundings and not get too close to the actual roadblock. And if we are sort of right there, we'll just, leave our car and go somewhere else until the roadblock ceases.
That's right. And we've, in the last few years, unfortunately, have observed some of that, whether that's Charlottesville, Virginia, or January 6th attacks, the insurrection on the Capitol, so much, but nothing to the scale. And so that's, I think, how Israelis, or many of my Israeli friends in college, experience that. In Gaza, you saw the response where you had the Israeli Defense Force, the Israeli military spokesperson calling them human animals. And so you just see massive dehumanization of Palestinians, not just Hamas, but the collective victimization of Palestinian civilians as being morally culpable for the attacks, the dehumanization coming out of parts of Netanyahu's coalition, including the radical right wing that is in Netanyahu's coalition. And it's heartbreaking. It's specifically heartbreaking to see this coming out of Israeli politicians in light of the legacy of the Holocaust, to call people human animals. It's like, it's devastating. And then the response, first the barrage of airstrikes and artillery, killing, not only destroying infrastructure, displacing people, killing Palestinian civilians. It's just it's a really tragic cycle of violence. And since 1967, if anything, we realized that retaliatory violence is not going to advance the peace process. There's not going if the political solution to this conflict were going to come by using escalating violence, we'd have already reached it. Right? This is a political problem that can't primarily be solved with military force.